Hello, everyone. My name is Molly Grace, and I'm really excited to be here as part of the Wednesdays for the Planet series. I am a research fellow in conservation biology at the University of Oxford in the Department of Zoology and at Wadham College, and I'm also a member of the Species Survival Commission of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. And in that role, I co-chair a working group that has spent many years developing a new way to measure species recovery called the IUCN Green Status of Species. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this exciting new metric works, and also how it might change the conversation about species recovery in Europe and around the world. So I'm recording this in June of 2021, and this happens to be a really exciting time for thinking about species recovery, because in just over a month's time, IUCN will publish the Green Status of Species standard. The standard is going to be a document that sets out a standardized way of thinking about and measuring species recovery in a step-by-step process. And the Green Status of Species will be a new part of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which I'll talk about more in a moment. If you're interested in reading the standard document, watch this space, look out for announcements on the IUCN website or on the various IUCN Twitter handles. You might be thinking, it's 2021. Is there really no definition of recovery that's come about before now? And it's true that over the decades, conservation scientists and practitioners have had many different ways that they've thought about recovery for a particular species. However, until the Green Status of Species, there's been no standardized, consistent way to think about recovery for any species, whether it's a terrestrial, marine, or freshwater species, an animal, a plant, or a fungus. And so having this consistent way to measure recovery will allow us to compare recovery between species. And the value of having a consistent way to think about conservation status is demonstrated so well by the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which, as I said, the green status is going to actually become a new part of. Many of you are probably already very familiar with the Red List. Traditionally, it has been a way to think about the extinction risk of species. By placing species in categories from critically endangered, which is the highest extinction risk category, all the way down to least concern, which indicates a species that has no danger of going extinct in the near future. So traditionally, over the past few decades, we've thought about conservation success by watching species move from a higher risk category to a lower risk category. However, the best a species can do under this system is to achieve a least concern status, which is not especially inspiring when it comes to species recovery. What it comes down to is this. With the Red List, we've had a metric to measure the thing that we want to avoid, which is species extinction. However, until the Green Status, there was no way to think about and measure what we wanted to achieve, which is species recovery. And if we don't have a definition of what recovery is, then there's no way that we can achieve it. So what is this recovery definition? So in the Green Status, we consider a species fully recovered if it is viable and ecologically functional throughout its pre-impact range. What do we mean by viable? We mean a species that is not in danger of going extinct. And so, of course, that is the first goal of any successful conservation program. What we mean by ecologically functional is that the species is able to fulfill all of its roles in the ecosystem. Think things like predator-prey interactions, pollination, water filtration, things like that. And so if a species population is too small, even if it's viable, it might not have enough individuals in the population to be carrying out all of its ecological functions. And sometimes humans could be doing something that prevents functioning as well. So we might have a species whose primary function is migration, and roads and fences are blocking migration and movement, meaning that the function of that species is not being carried out. The last component of that recovery definition is that the species should be found throughout its pre-impact range. And this was something that was really important to us to include in the recovery definition to combat a phenomenon called shifting baselines. So what shifting baselines means is that the way that humans think about nature is generally really influenced by our own personal experience, what we experience in our own lifetimes. And so that means that if nature is continually degraded generation upon generation, then each subsequent generation will have a different idea of what's normal in the natural world, how many individuals of a species there are, how widely that species is distributed. And the gray whale is a really great example of this shifting baselines phenomenon. So gray whales were hit really hard by commercial whaling, but that decline in the species ended in the 1940s when the international community passed the Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. So after that convention was passed, the gray whale numbers stabilized and eventually in the past few decades have begun to increase again. So because we have a stable, increasing population, this species is rightly considered least concern. There's no worry that this species is going to disappear from the face of the planet anytime soon. However, when I reveal the rest of this figure, we can see that prior to commercial whaling, there were many, many more gray whales in the world than there are currently. In fact, the species used to be found in the Atlantic Ocean, and today it's not found there at all. So my point here is that if we just zoom in on recent memory, then we lose the big picture when it comes to species recovery. So coming back to this definition, if a species fully met this definition, it would receive a score of 100% using the green status method. And if a species was extinct or extinct in the wild, it would receive a score of 0%. Of course, most species are somewhere in between, and so we can break up those percentages into categories, just like in the red list. So at the very top, at 100%, we have a fully recovered or non-depleted species. And then moving down through the categories slightly depleted, moderately depleted, largely depleted, and finally critically depleted, which is the worst possible status before extinction. So if we apply this to the case of the gray whale, we find that the gray whale is actually considered largely depleted. So moving forward, we can think of the conservation status of the gray whale as least concern, largely depleted, which takes into account both its extinction risk and its recovery score. Now, as I said, the green status is very new, but colleagues and I have been working to preliminarily apply the methods to some species in Europe to see what that tells us about European recovery efforts. And in 2013, there was a really great report published called Wildlife Comeback in Europe that provides a lot of the data necessary to conduct green status of species assessments for European species. So that's where the data for a lot of these preliminary results is going to be coming from. What did we find? Well, first of all, we found a number of species that would be considered critically depleted. So remember, that's the worst possible category in the green status framework. So they had a score of less than 20%. And in Europe, this includes species like the Iberian lynx, the bearded vulture, and the wolverine. You might notice something interesting about these species is that none of them are considered critically endangered on the European red list, which is the worst possible extinction risk category. So they are endangered or vulnerable, which are both threatened categories on the red list, but it's not the worst possible category. So what this tells us is that conservation has done a good job reducing the extinction risk for these species, but in terms of recovery, there's still a long way to go. What's more interesting is the case of these three species, which are all considered least concern on the European red list, but on the green status, they're considered largely depleted. So the same category as the gray whale example from earlier. So here we have the gray wolf, the Eurasian lynx, and the brown bear. And all of these species are large carnivores, or in the case of the bear, omnivores. And we know that these types of species are really important for the function of regulating food webs and keeping balance in food webs. So hopefully having results like this from the green status will provide some incentive to have more ambitious recovery planning for these species, even though they're not in any danger of extinction presently. But there is some good news to share. So here are three species that are considered least concern in terms of extinction risk, and they're also only considered slightly depleted in terms of their recovery status. So this is the category just below fully recovered. It means they have a score of greater than 80%. Here we have species like the elk, the barnacle goose, and the alpine ibex. And what links all three of these species is that there have been really good conservation measures put in place, mostly regulation of hunting, that has allowed these species to rebound really close to pre-impact levels. What you might notice is different about these three species from some of the species I've shown before is that, for one thing, some of them have been undergoing conservation efforts over a longer period of time. And they also have a higher rate of reproduction, which means that they can rebound faster and recover faster. But what these 3 species show me is that conservation can and does work to achieve recovery outcomes for species, and it gives me a lot of hope for other European species too. So what are the next steps for the green status of species? Of course, our primary objective is to assess as many species as possible so that we can start comparing recovery status of species around the world. And indeed, this objective is already well underway. And in fact, by the end of the year, you can expect to start seeing green status of species information online on red list species profiles. Until then, keep an eye out for announcements about the green status of species standard if you want to learn more. Thanks very much. And if you'd like to learn more, feel free to contact me or check out the Green Status of Species web pages.